Thank you so much, everyone. Welcome. So a couple things. Earlier in the session, Nora had just did her land acknowledgement. And I just also wanted to take a few minutes to just say that I do want to acknowledge that I teach on unceded Tongva lands and I live on Chumash territory. And you know, I've been really reflecting on what that really means, besides doing a land acknowledgement and having maybe a few pieces written by Indigenous authors in my curriculum, right? What does it mean to really honor that? And I heard this great presentation where they talked about this importance of being in right relationship and how that's so important in our work, and how it's important not to just, in this case, and in my case, since I work at UCLA, to teach about the Tongva, but to really honor Tongva presence, to recognize that Tongva still exists and continue to exist. And so, you know, I'm really working on that for myself and just thinking, reflecting about how to make that a more visible part of my practice. And so I just want to welcome everyone to be reflecting on that. Nora shared the link, which I meant to grab. It's on the PowerPoint, but I'm going to not stop the share to do that, just so that everyone can know which native lands that you live on and that you teach on, if those are different. I also want to just acknowledge that schooling and schools have been a source of white supremacy and racism. And we exist as teacher educators, as people that, unless we purposely work against that, we are reproducing whiteness, white supremacy, racism. That is, thank you so much, Sumita. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, because as much as I'm going to try to share and have engage in some dialogue around what it means to work towards anti-racist and abolitionist teaching, you know, we exist also in a system still of testing and of structures of schooling that often work to deculturalize our young people, to frame our young people in deficit ways. And so I just wanted to offer humbly that what I'm bringing is a workshop that is meant to engage you and to engage us in dialogue, and not to say that that myself or anyone else has already arrived at that, because we exist in the system. And so I hope to think about what it might mean to reimagine that system, right? For me, as an Asian American woman, and when I went to undergrad, I was really moved by Mari Matsuda, who talked about what it means to be an Asian American in the racial hierarchy in the United States, right? And she talks about this idea of the racial middle being something that can be used for white supremacy, or it can be used to refuse white supremacy, right? And so if we abandon our connections to people of color, if we refuse to if or we can refuse to abandon communities of color, right? And I've really been thinking about what that means in the work of teacher ed. You know, I felt like I knew what that meant as a teacher. At least I thought I did. And now in teacher ed, as sort of like one's removed from the classroom, even though we're there, that's just something that I've been really, really thinking about. And so, you know, the other person that has been a light for me is, of course, Yuri Kochiyama, and just really considering the ways that she worked in solidarity with other communities. You know, she did so much work in the Asian American movement, obviously, with Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement, and also thinking about political prisoners and what it means to advocate worldwide and not just in the United States, right? And so I've been trying to think about what that means in the context of teacher ed. So I just wanted to share where I'm at, what I've been thinking about. When I say that I want to promote anti-racist or abolitionist teaching, you know, I realize it's complicated and it's nuanced, and we're all in different, you know, states of development for that. So I just want to acknowledge that and to just invite everyone into that space of of thinking and reflecting and trying to understand who we are in relationship to different communities who have also been marginalized. And so here's the question, the key question for this session, right? How do we develop and promote anti-racist or abolitionist teaching in the context of recovering from the trauma and uncertainty of the pandemic and crisis learning? I think, and a lot of you all have already mentioned this, and I just so much appreciated these comments that, you know, there's so much narrative and rhetoric around learning loss and ways that young people are behind. And I appreciated so much the people who also wanted to offer that our young people have also learned so much about resilience and about how to hold themselves and their families in the midst of trauma and how to find joy even in quarantine, right? And so, you know, I've been thinking about that, and what does it mean for us then as teacher educators, right? To be preparing teachers who are also recovering from and still existing in spaces of trauma and uncertainty, and how hard that is. And I just want to say like how I just felt so inspired by the teacher candidates that I got to work with last year for keeping in mind all of their commitments, all of the things that they wanted to do, even when they were frustrated by Zoom. And I feel like, you know, right now, as we enter a very, very uncertain time where we're not sure, are we going back? Are we not going back? What does this all mean? That for me, the important thing has been, right, sorry, is this idea of finding our North Star, right? Of being in touch with what are our North Stars in our teaching. And so in Bettina Love's book, right, she references bell hooks, who talks about this idea that theory has helped her to name her pain, has helped her to find understanding and healing from that. And then she says that she has this great part where she says, Polaris is often called the North Star. It is one of the brightest stars in the sky. Even when a full moon masks the starry skies, a North Star can still be seen. It never changes positions. It always points north. For enslaved folks fleeing bondage, the North Star marked the way to freedom. Abolitionists used the North Star to guide escaping enslaved folks north. It was a constant reminder to freedom dream, and theory is my North Star. And, you know, during distance learning, crisis learning, the pandemic, what I think is most important for all of us, and especially for our teacher candidates and their young people, is what are our North Stars, right? What are the things that make this work worth it, right? If all we're doing is reproducing the status quo, that's not really worth all of our time and energy, right? We're here because we want to do transformative work. And so, you know, I just felt so inspired, even with all of its limitations, to get to work with teacher candidates who were able to keep as their North Stars anti-racism and abolitionist teaching, ideas of equity, and just humanizing relationships with their young people, really cultivating those relationships, even when they were in a Zoom and all the screens were blank, being able to have those conversations via chat, or even after their official lesson was done, you know, being able to cultivate that even in the midst of all that we've been through in the last year. And so I just really wanted to acknowledge that, to acknowledge all of you for being here during the summer when we've been through so much. And so I just wanted to invite everyone then to think through, and if you can put in the chat, how do you define anti-racist or abolitionist teaching? What does it look like, feel like, sound like? What, you know, you're in this session. What does it mean to you? So thank you so much for all of these responses so far, thinking about what does it mean to listen to our young people, to create those safe spaces for conversations, being critically optimistic. I've also heard that phrase as critical hope, right? How can we be realistic and direct and warm? A student-centered classroom where all voices are heard and honored. Oh yes, Marissa, I love that quote from Maya Angelou. It is actually the cover photo on my iPhone. Doing the best I can until I know better, and when I know better, to do better. Thank you, Susan. Anti-white supremacy. It took us a while to name the word white supremacy in the chat, to name race. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Getting to know families and caregivers and communities. All students are seen and heard, an inclusive curriculum, critical literacy lens. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Feel free to continue writing in the chat as you as we continue this session. I actually am going to stop share because I need to grab a link. So I'm going to most of this presentation is going to focus on defining anti-racist teaching, actually or reframing anti-racist teaching in terms of abolition and abolitionist teaching. And last year, when I did a similar session, slightly different, but I talked a little bit about maybe some of the distinctions between anti-racism and abolitionist teaching. Thank you so much, everyone. And I wanted to, we're just going to start there this time. So the link I provided is a chart that I used. There's a couple pages in We Want to Do More Than Survive by Bettina Love. Where she defines what abolitionist teaching is. I think it's something like page 5, 4, and 5. I think it's on there. Sorry. The other issue with today is somehow my internet is super unstable. So every time I open another window, my computer starts spinning, and then I get the little thing that pops up that says your internet is unstable. So hopefully this goes well. And so I just wanted to invite everyone to go ahead and open up that link if you're able to do that, obviously. And just thinking about what are these different ways that Bettina Love defines abolitionist teaching, right? And I think I put in there some questions that I think are really important for us to ask ourselves. There's a column for us as teacher educators, and then there's a column for questions for teacher candidates, right? So a couple of highlights, right? She talks about how abolitionist teaching is choosing to engage in the struggle for educational justice, refusing oppression, and to refuse to oppress others, reimagining and rewriting our curriculum, knowing that freedom is impossible without women and queer leaders, refusing to take part in zero tolerance policies and the school to prison pipeline, demanding restorative justice, calling out other teachers who diminish dark children and who do not think dark children matter. She talks a lot about Black joy and Black mattering, right? Acknowledging and accepting that America and its policies are inherently anti-Black, racist, discriminatory, and unjust. That we're actually founded on those principles, but that we have an opportunity to reimagine those, right? And to abandon teaching gimmicks like grit that present experiences of dark youth as ahistorical and further pathologize them, right? So, oh, our young students of color are not successful because they don't have grit, and let's help them have grit when we understand that actually there's this whole history that is working against them. And so there's a lot more in the document, but I did want to note that what I tried to do was actually go through and code those ways that she defines abolitionist teaching. Part of it is because, I really struggle even with the idea, can we even be abolitionists when we're in the system? And so it's something that I'm always thinking, like, can you be an abolitionist in the system that you're trying to abolish? And, Assata Shakur talks about how the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So, what I try to do is go through it in my head and just sort of code these and think about, I think the pieces that she has in this chart really boil down to these five categories, right? So this personal development, or who am I? And who am I in relationship to my young people and to the community in which I teach? And what are the connections to communities and caregivers and families? So with whom am I connected, and do I do this work? And she talks about, really being important to have a connection to for example, services that support immigrant students and especially undocumented students, right? That we know that the school won't serve all of their needs. And so what are those connections that we can make? A curriculum that centers BIPOC, femme, trans, queer, disabled, immigrant narratives and voices. So the question here, what or who is at the center of my teaching? My classroom ecology, right? How am I structuring my classroom and my teaching? And then school and educational activism, like when a teacher says something problematic, can I call that out? Can I be an activist in that space? Are there other spaces that I'm in that are trying to actually change things in the school system? And so what I thought we would do is just take a few minutes to reflect. If we could go into breakout rooms, Jane, it doesn't matter to me how many, especially if we're teaching from our homes and our young people are participating in school from our homes too, right? And what does subversion mean in that context? So if we could be in breakout rooms and just discussing what are some things you're noticing, what are things that are resonating, and then is there something that you would like to focus on? Welcome back, everyone. Feel free to share in the chat something that your group talked about, and or if anybody would like to unmute and just share one thing that you talked about before we move on to the second half of this session.
Our group basically just simply, what's the lady's name? We were in group. I'm Denise Price, and we basically spoke about experiences that we've had and working with teach and what the new teaching system will look like, because with the CBEST no longer being a requirement, a lot of um, say I know a lot of African American males have expressed a desire to go into education. Not that they couldn't pass the CBEST, but it was more or less many of them were rather than take a test, were going into other fields. And I think that this will be an issue where it, they can relate to other students, especially males and student athletes. So I think that that will be hopefully an advantage and another avenue in which these students will have to someone that they can relate to. And I was sharing my experiences having been a principal and having been in education when the CBEST came into play. Many teachers who were really good teachers were pulled out due to their not being able to pass the CBEST, but not because they weren't adequately prepared to teach. The CBEST was sort, in my opinion, a deterrent.
Yes.
That was thrown in there that many minorities were not able to pursue. And they went on to other careers, and the education in California, in my opinion, just sort of declined. So I'm glad that there are other alternatives now that are being looked at, because we need to have role models for all ethnicities and students represented in a classroom.
Yes, thank you so much. Anyone else want to share? Yes, and thank you. Yeah, so I will add, and somebody sort of is prompting me to say this, so to comment on this. And, I think one of the reasons that so I love Bettina Love's work, and I love how Bettina Love frames anti-racist teaching in terms of abolition, right? And I think something that I shared last year was, when we talk about the word anti-racist, sometimes that gets misused as like, oh, as long as I'm not like overtly racist, I'm okay, right? I'm in the clear. And what I love about abolition is it's asking us to work towards something. One thing that really gives me pause though about naming this work as abolitionist is that it really doesn't deal with the dismantling of the system, right? Of the school to prison pipeline, of the ways that particular students, especially our Black male students, but actually many students of color are targeted and criminalized through our system, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but also just ways that the school system tends, right? It actually was at its heart designed, right, to reproduce the status quo and designed not to promote abolition. And so again, I think that I have my own little internal qualms about it, but I also want to say how important it is that we're working towards something. We're working towards abolition, towards freedom, right? And what Bettina Love talks about as freedom dreaming, and how important that is to me, that it's not just about my students not using oppressive language. It's not just about my young people, not bullying each other, but it's about them understanding what are we, like, we're learning this. Why are we learning this? Because we can imagine a better and future world, right? And hopefully also a world where prisons don't exist, where we don't need something like the CBEST or CSET as gatekeepers to our system. So I just wanted to name that and to explicitly say that, on some level, whatever we're doing is not actually, ever really going to be enough until we really see actual like justice happening, right? Actual abolition. Um, so I wanted to move us to thinking about, so if this is how we're defining abolitionist teaching or anti-racist teaching, how do we do that in field support, right? What does that mean? And like, how can we think about this? And so something that I've been, again, trying to think about is this observation cycle, right? I don't know what your institutions call it. This is what I've been calling it, my field support or my observation cycle. So, right, it's sort of this cyclical planning and pre-conferencing, and then the actual observation, and then the debrief, which all sort of cycles together, and we keep, it keeps it, it's continuing to inform our work with the teacher candidates. And so what I am I'm gonna share a few ideas, but I also wanted to ask everyone to just identify a moment or a situation, maybe a particular teacher candidate or a cooperating teacher, in which you felt it was particularly important to focus on developing that teacher candidate's implementation of anti-racist or abolitionist teaching. So if we take a minute to just remember some these moments, because for me, and I'm sure for many people, they're very emotional and challenging, and they're things that I agonize over. It doesn't take me that long to come up with them, but if you need a minute, let's take a minute to think about those moments and identify one of them. And if you already have that moment, then what types of discussions, assignments, or activities might support that teacher candidate in developing their anti-racist abolitionist teaching philosophies and pedagogies? But just focus on the first questions. We're going to take a minute just for everyone to think. Thank you, Kevin, for adding the stage of analyze. I'll share that I think, you know, I appreciate that. I also think that analyzing hopefully is happening at all those stages, right? As we're pre-conferencing with our teacher candidates, we're analyzing their lesson plans together. We're analyzing what their goals are, what they say they want us to focus on during the observation. Even during the observation, we maybe are having some interchanges, right? Where they're maybe signaling us like, oh, hey, can you write that down? Or can you note this moment for me? Because I'm wondering what's going on, right? We want to have those signals with them. So, and then of course, in the debrief. So I think, so I appreciate that as an explicit stage, and also honoring that some people might not have that as a named stage. I'm sure everybody has a different model. I think they're all great. This was just what I thought might be useful for us today. And so just, I'm going to give you a link to a Jamboard in a second, where we're kind of going to be in those groups and brainstorming ways that we might promote abolitionist or anti-racist teaching in these different stages, but also recognizing that that's also happening in between those stages too, right? So I just want to start with, you know, in Bettina Love's text in Abolitionist Teaching, if you read, one of the questions was talking about like, how do we even get in touch with our biases, with the ways that we've inherently, we've internalized anti-Blackness as a way that we think about our classrooms and our schools and our society. How do we like unlearn those, right? And I really appreciated this. It was an IG post by, I think it was Anti-Racist Education, but a tweet by Dr. Courtney Rose, right? Normalize sharing with students that you're still critically reflecting on narratives you've internalized about certain topics and issues, and acknowledge that you may have unexplored biases and assumptions that need to be addressed. And I think, you know, it's really easy in a way for me to say that. And then there's the deeper emotional work, the labor, right? People talk about this idea of emotional labor because it is labor to really be reflecting, for example, on ways that I have internalized cis heteronormativity, right? As a straight cis woman. And so thinking about, gosh, yeah, do I tend to assume that somebody's a she or he is identifies as male or female based on their name? Yeah, I do that. Oh gosh, like I really need to work on that. I need to change that because I am marginalizing my students and folks that identify as non-binary, who identify in other ways. And so I think it's just important for us to say those things out loud with our students so that they can also start thinking through things in that way, right? Let's see, I'm gonna skip that. So a couple of sort of nuances or points from Bettina Love's book. She talks about this way that how do we center the knowledge, expertise, and narratives of BIPOC and people experience marginalization. And then I think in particular, how do we push past representation and multiculturalism, right? It's not just about including those narratives in our curriculum. And for us in teacher ed, right? Who are the authors that we're citing? What are the sources that we use in our teaching? But how do we actually recenter, right, on communities of color? And so I think, you know, the essential questions that we use in our own teaching, right? What are the essential questions we use in our teaching? And then what are the essential questions that we help our teachers develop, right? Um, and then so I'll just say, like, one thing that I have found to be super helpful is to, before I observe, to ask teacher candidates, what are your concerns? What are your goals? Not just in terms of what they want students to learn, which is of course important, the content is really important, but also their pedagogical approaches. You know, I had made the comment earlier, which I thought was so great. We got to watch this video of a teacher teaching and this interchange that happens with students. And there's one student who was very enthusiastically talking about predator and prey. And one of the questions that I had, which I would ask that teacher candidate, is like, you know, oh, well, what was going on with that student? Because I have definitely made the mistake of assuming that student was like taking over and kind of like overstepping, taking up too much space. And I've had teacher candidates tell me, oh my gosh, that student has not once talked in my class, but they got so excited about this one topic. And so really trying to think, how do we ask teacher candidates about what their concerns are, about how they're analyzing, how they want us to analyze things as we come into their classrooms, and therefore what types of observable data can we help collect, right? And I also wanted to talk about, what are their plans for addressing oppressive language, right? How do they make sure that they're preventing and educating, right? So it can't just be like, oh, this student uses queerphobic epithet in my class and now I'm going to teach on it. But how do I teach on these issues before they come up, right? How do I prevent and educate? And then how do I interrupt and address when it happens? And I did have some examples, but I think these are also conversations that we want to have before the observation, right? And obviously we can't have all the conversations all at once, but along the way, right? If we think about those categories of Bettina Love's work on abolitionist teaching, one of those is classroom ecology, right? How do we teach and how much that matters? And that has to be an intentional, something that we're doing, not something that we're responding to. Okay, so that was some different, like, oh yeah, so here's some examples of things, artifacts that my teachers came up with: practicing pronouns, challenging queer and trans exclusive language, the history of the N-word. So just having them teach on these concepts before things happen. And then also, sorry, I'm just trying to get us to the discussion part. Again, what types of data can our students have us collect? So are there ways that we can collect data for them on discipline? Who are they affirming and who are they disciplining? Participation patterns, looking at grades, achievement, right? What are the things that we can help collect while we're in those observations that might shed light on what's happening in the classroom? So I had an example, but I'm gonna skip it because sorry, let me just fly through these, sorry. So what I was hoping we could do is I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and hope that's the right link, yes. And we'll have this Jamboard, and I was just thinking, okay, so this moment or situation that you identified, what are those discussions, assignments, activities, questions that might help in that situation? And it might not be easy to identify those as something that you would do in the pre-conferencing, during the observation, or during the debrief, and if you want to add a stage there for analysis, that's great. Feel free to add that. And to try to think about what are those different types of things that we can help students analyze and then respond to, so that they are promoting abolition, right? They're promoting freedom dreaming in their classrooms. So the Jamboard kind of has that observation cycle. Again, feel free to add a stage to that if you want. And I just thought we could have to just discuss, okay, what are those things that we can do as field supervisors in those different stages. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're pretty much done. So I just wanted to offer the space. Any closing reflections, things that your group talked about that you would like to share whole group?
Darlene, I'll offer something if that's all right.
Yeah, that's great.
Just what I appreciate this very much because we've been thinking about this in similar vein. The idea if there's some coordination between what we're doing in our observations and what's happening in the context of talks and seminars and stuff, so they live along the same road. So we're talking the same thing both in the content of what they're doing in their coursework, in their methods courses, all those things alongside what they should be doing in their observations.
Yeah, and that was super evident in your talk too, Johnny, which I really appreciated, just seeing like how what we do in the field translates to the classroom. Thank you. I hope that we can have more conversation. Feel free to reach out if you want to talk more, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. I'm just